Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. We're here to really get under the skin of complex ideas, breaking them down so you can navigate, well, the world with a bit more insight. Today, we're stepping into quite a challenging space, actually, one that pushes against a lot of our usual ideas about strength, about success, even about courage itself. We're diving deep into this rather surprising idea that real courage isn't about having no fear at all. It's about the willingness to show up, properly show up, even when you feel incredibly vulnerable. Think about that phrase, being in the arena. Such a powerful image, isn't it? The credit doesn't go to the critic, the one shouting from the sidelines. No. It belongs to the person whose face is, marred by dust and sweat and blood, who really tries, who makes mistakes, who falls short. Because effort always involves mistakes, doesn't it? But they're the one actually doing the deeds, throwing themselves into something worthwhile. Even if they fail while daring greatly. And that's what we're exploring today. The seemingly backwards path to courage, to feeling like you belong, to living a really engaged life. So, our aim today is to properly understand how vulnerability, which, let's be honest, most of us think of as weakness, is actually where all the good stuff comes from. Love, joy, that sense of belonging, creativity. It all starts there. We'll look at the ways we try to protect ourselves, often without even realizing it, and crucially, how to be a bit more courageous, more engaged, more wholehearted, you might say. This isn't just abstract theory. We're talking practical shifts, things you can actually think about applying in your own life, both personally and professionally. And to help us navigate this, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our expert speaker today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here to talk about something so fundamental to being human. When we discuss vulnerability, it's not just feeling a bit exposed, fundamentally. Vulnerability is about being all in, fully engaging. It's that willingness to show up, despite the uncertainty, despite the risks, despite the emotional exposure that comes with just engaging with life. As you said with the arena metaphor, it's not about winning or losing being guaranteed. It's understanding that both are possibilities and choosing to get in there anyway. Our research really shows that vulnerability is the absolute core of all our emotions, all our feelings. To genuinely feel anything, love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, creativity, you have to be vulnerable. They're born from it.
I think many of us have an almost gut reaction against that, though, sort of recoil,
Hmm.
that immediate urge to control things, to fix the discomfort, make it go away. I've heard it described as excruciating, and that word really lands. That deep, almost physical unease when you're facing the unknown or the risk of being hurt.
Yeah.
What's the actual cost then when that fear takes over and we just shut down,
Yeah.
disengage?
Well, the cost is huge, actually, and often hidden. When we shield ourselves by disengaging, by holding back, playing it safe, we inadvertently cut ourselves off. Cut ourselves off from the very experiences that make life meaningful. One person we spoke to put it so clearly, I hate vulnerability, hate uncertainty, hate not knowing. Can't stand opening myself up to getting hurt or disappointed. It's excruciating. And this deep need to control, to make things better or perfect, it often leads to quite frantic behavior, doesn't it? Blaming others, obsessive cleaning, micromanaging at work, anything to feel in control. But when you can't fix it, when that uncertainty is just there, choosing to disengage means you lose out. You lose the courage, the clarity of purpose that actually comes from leaning into that discomfort. It means letting go of needing more thinking and less feeling, which is, well, profoundly counterintuitive for many of us, especially in professions where analytical thinking is prized, perhaps. But it's vital for wholehearted living.
Right. So if vulnerability is so essential, yet we try so hard to avoid it, what's
Mhm.
really driving that fear? Is it just us, or is there something bigger going on? You mentioned this idea of a culture of never enough. Can you expand on that? How does scarcity impact us?
Oh, it's definitely a cultural force, a huge one. This never enough problem. It's deeply woven into the fabric of our society. It shows up as this constant nagging sense that we aren't good enough, or safe enough, certain enough, perfect enough. And it fuels this relentless comparison, just constantly measuring ourselves against these ideals that are often, well, frankly, unattainable or even fictional. Whether it's the perfect lives on social media, those media images of success, or even just our own rose-tinted memories of how things used to be. It's a race you just can't win because the goalposts are always shifting, aren't they? And this scarcity mindset, it's actively fed by three key things we see in almost any system: families, workplaces, communities. First, there's shame. When shame is the currency, you get environments filled with fear. Fear of ridicule, belittling, blame, finger-pointing. Your self-worth gets tangled up with your achievements, your productivity, or just towing the line. It creates this really fragile foundation.
That sounds incredibly stressful. And the second condition.
The second is comparison. Not healthy competition, mind you, but this constant, often subtle ranking of people. It just suffocates creativity, makes people terrified of being different. It sets these narrow, rigid standards for what's valued. If there's only one right way to be, or one talent that matters, then almost everyone feels like they're falling short most of the time.
Which must lead straight into the third condition.
Exactly. Disengagement. When people are operating under that shadow of shame and constant comparison, they stop taking risks. It feels much safer to keep quiet than to share a new idea or a personal story or even just their honest experience. People really struggle to feel seen and heard. And that leads to this profound lack of real participation, commitment, energy within the whole system. But the really key insight here is that the opposite of never enough isn't just having loads more stuff or abundance. The true opposite of scarcity is enough, or what we call wholeheartedness. And that feeling of enough, it's fundamentally rooted in the courage to be vulnerable and believing you are worthy just as you are. You can't get there if you're constantly guarding yourself.
That makes perfect sense. And it really brings us to tackling some of the big myths about vulnerability head on, because they stop us engaging, don't they? The biggest one has to be vulnerability is weakness. We hear that all the time. It seems so deeply ingrained.
It absolutely is the most common and probably the most damaging myth out there. But let's just pull it apart for a second. Linguistically, vulnerability comes from the Latin vulnere, meaning to wound. So it's about the capacity to be wounded, whereas weakness is the inability to withstand attack. They're actually very different concepts. In fact, you could argue that a lot of what we see as weakness actually comes from a lack of vulnerability. When we refuse to acknowledge where we're tender, where we're exposed, we're actually more likely to get hurt because we're completely unprepared.
That's a really interesting paradox.
It is. And look at the evidence. In health psychology, research shows that acknowledging you are vulnerable to illness, accepting the risk, actually makes you more likely to stick to healthy habits. Believing you're invincible doesn't protect you. Similarly, in social psychology, there's fascinating work showing that people who thought they weren't susceptible to manipulative advertising were, ironically, the most easily swayed. That illusion of invulnerability actually undermines your real protection. And here's a really profound bit, the thing that took years of research to truly grasp. Vulnerability isn't just about the tough emotions, fear, shame, grief. It's the cradle of all emotions. It's where love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, creativity, all of it originates. To feel anything deeply is to be vulnerable. So to say vulnerability is weakness is basically saying feeling is weakness, which means shutting ourselves off from everything that makes life rich and meaningful. Just think about what actually takes courage day to day. Starting that difficult conversation, asking for help when you're struggling, showing up for someone in pain, taking responsibility for a mistake, getting back up after you've fallen flat on your face, perhaps publicly. None of those are weak. They are incredibly courageous acts demanding huge vulnerability. They feel like truth, like courage in action.
That completely reframes it, doesn't it? Turns that old wisdom on its head. Which leads nicely to that other phrase you hear, oh, I just don't do vulnerability. People say it almost like a boast sometimes, especially perhaps in certain high-pressure jobs, but you're saying, that's just not possible. You can't opt out.
Utterly impossible. Yes, you hear it often, don't you? Sometimes linked to a profession. I'm a surgeon, we don't do vulnerability, or even real men don't. Boo. But the plain fact is, there's no escape clause. Uncertainty, risk, emotional exposure, they aren't optional extras in life. They're woven into the very fabric of being human. Life is vulnerable. You simply cannot opt out. Think about it. Applying for that promotion, going on a first date, trying to learn a completely new skill where you know you'll look foolish at first, speaking up with a different opinion in a meeting full of senior colleagues, even deciding to start a family. Every single one involves uncertainty, risk of failure or rejection, and definite emotional exposure. To live is to be vulnerable. The only choice we actually have is how we engage with that inherent vulnerability.
Okay, so it's not if, it's how we engage. Which raises a really important point. Where's the line? Because another big misconception is that vulnerability means just blurting everything out, oversharing, essentially.
That's a critical distinction, yes, and one that causes a lot of confusion. True vulnerability is not just dumping all your personal information indiscriminately. It's not like some reality TV confession, not at all. Genuine vulnerability is about sharing your feelings, your experiences, appropriately, with boundaries, and crucially, with people who have earned the right to hear your story. It's a mutual process built on reciprocity, and it's absolutely fundamental for building real trust. You wouldn't pour your heart out to a stranger on the train, would you? Or the first person you meet at a conference. That kind of disclosure often comes from a place of desperation or maybe an unhealed hurt, but it's not real vulnerability.
So how does that trust get built then? if it's not instant disclosure?
Well, our research points to trust being built very slowly, incrementally. What we call marble by marble. We use this marble jar metaphor. Imagine a jar. Every time someone shows up for you, is kind, sticks up for you, keeps your confidence, you put a marble in the jar. And when they're disrespectful or betray a confidence, marbles come out. It's that slow, steady accumulation of positive, trustworthy actions that builds real, lasting trust. And conversely, big betrayals rarely happen out of the blue. They often come after a period where trust has been slowly leaking away, marble by marble. Relationship research, like John Gottman's work, really backs this up too. Simple, consistent engagement, like genuinely asking about someone's day and properly listening, is vital. When we stop making those small bits for connection, that disengagement sends a powerful message that you don't care, which is deeply painful and erodes trust over time.
That marble jar is such a great way to visualize it, that gradual building of trust. And that need for connection for others, it really pushes back against that other story we tell ourselves, doesn't it? The rugged individual, the lone wolf. We tend to admire that figure, but you're saying that's actually quite a flawed approach when it comes to navigating vulnerability.
Oh, deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Yes, our culture often celebrates the lone wolf, the self-made person who conquers everything alone. But the reality is the vulnerability journey isn't one we can or even should attempt on our own. We absolutely need support. We need people around us who let us try out new ways of being, new ways of showing up without judging us. And we need people who will help us back up when we fall flat on our faces in that arena. Because if you're truly living bravely, you will fall. The people in our studies consistently talked about needing encouragement, support, often professional help, as they started to re-engage with vulnerability.
It's interesting, isn't it? Most of us are probably quite comfortable giving help.
Yes. We're generally okay at offering advice, lending a hand. But asking for help, that's often much harder. Yet, as the saying goes, until we can receive with an open heart, we are never truly giving with an open heart. If we attach judgment or inadequacy to receiving help, we tend to project that onto giving it too. Personally, I know for a fact I couldn't have navigated my own journey without my husband, a brilliant therapist, insights from countless books, and the empathy of friends who are walking a similar path. And there's strong leadership research that supports this too. A piece in the Harvard Business Review talked about this snowball effect. When a leader has the courage to be vulnerable with their team, it's seen not as weakness, but as real courage. And that act inspires others to do the same. It creates this ripple effect of openness, trust, and often surprisingly more innovation throughout the organization.
That's incredibly powerful. The idea that a leader's vulnerability can actually unlock courage in others. A really vital point for anyone in a leadership position, or indeed working within a team. Right, let's shift gears slightly to perhaps the most difficult part of this whole conversation. Shame. It's a word that makes most of us want to look away, doesn't it? Why is it so important to actually lean into understanding shame, even though it feels so uncomfortable?
It is uncomfortable, and often the more we try to avoid it, the more power it actually holds over us. Let's start with what I sometimes call the shame 1, 2, 3s. First, universality. Everyone feels shame. The only people who don't are those who lack the basic human capacity for empathy and connection. So you either admit you feel shame, or you basically admit you're a sociopath. There's no middle ground.
Okay, that's a stark choice.
It is. Second, silence. We are all universally afraid to talk about it. Shame loves secrecy. It festers in the dark. And third, control. The less we talk about shame, the more control it has over our lives. It's an incredibly powerful, often debilitating emotion. At its absolute core, shame is the fear of disconnection. As humans, we are fundamentally hardwired for connection, for love, for belonging. Shame is that intensely painful feeling, that experience of believing we are fundamentally flawed, that something about us, something we did fail to do, or some ideal we didn't live up to, makes us unworthy of that connection. It's that voice whispering, I'm not good enough.
And that's different from guilt.
Critically different, yes. Guilt is feeling bad about a behavior. I did something bad. Shame is feeling bad about who you are. I am bad. It's also different from embarrassment, which is usually fleeting, often happens in public, and you kind of know you're not alone in feeling foolish. Shame feels incredibly isolating. When shame hits, it triggers those primal fight-or-flight responses. We tend to react in one of three main ways. We might move away, withdraw, hide, keep secrets. Or we might move toward, try to appease, people pleasers, blend in. Or sometimes we move against, try to gain power over others, become aggressive, maybe even use shame against someone else to deflect our own discomfort. Think of sending a really nasty email, for instance. But all these strategies ultimately move us further away from genuine connection. They keep us trapped in that isolating pain.
It sounds like a really powerful force, almost like quicksand. So how do we fight back? How do we become, as you put it, gremlin ninja warriors? What does shame resilience look like?
Right, shame resilience isn't about stopping shame from ever happening. If we value connection, the fear of disconnection, shame will always be a possibility. Resilience is about developing the ability to practice authenticity even when we feel shame, to move through that awful feeling without ditching our values, and crucially, to come out the other side with more courage, more compassion, and more connection than before. The number one antidote to shame is empathy. When we find the courage to share our vulnerable story with someone who responds with genuine empathy and understanding, that simple healing message of "you're not alone" or "me too," shame just cannot survive that. It needs secrecy and judgment to thrive. Empathy cuts off its oxygen supply. Self-compassion is also absolutely vital. Being kind to ourselves when we're feeling shame, acknowledging our common humanity, our imperfections, that makes us much more likely to actually reach out for that external empathy we need. I remember a really humbling moment myself. I accidentally sent a truly vicious email meant for my husband to the actual person I was furious with professionally. The shame was instant, physical, overwhelming. My inner gremlins were having a party. "You're a fraud. You're useless. How could you be so stupid?" My body just reacted. But by reaching out, talking to just one or two trusted friends who met me with that Me Too empathy, I managed to get back on my feet. It allowed me to respond authentically, apologize properly, and then set the boundaries that were needed. That empathy was like a social balm. It helped me move through it.
That's such a vivid example of how connection can pull us out of that shame spiral.
Absolutely. And it's backed by solid research. James Pennebaker's work on trauma, for example, show that not talking about a traumatic event could be more damaging than the event itself. But when people did share their stories, their physical health improved, doctor visits went down, stress hormones reduced. It really underlines that old saying, "You're only as sick as your secrets." Bringing shame into the light by talking about it is probably the most powerful part of resilience.
A crucial lesson. Now, your research also highlights some really interesting differences in how men and women tend to experience shame. You use these metaphors of webs and boxes. Could you unpack those for us?
Yes. The way shame gets internalized often varies quite a bit based on gender, largely due to deeply ingrained social expectations. For women, I often see what I call the web. It's this incredibly complex, sticky tangle of layered, conflicting, and nearly always impossible expectations about who and how they should be. Think about it. Women are often expected to be perfect, but effortlessly so. Sexual, but also modest. Confident, but not too assertive or loud. Trying to meet these contradictory demands just traps them further in the web. Every choice seems to lead to judgment or disappointment somewhere. One woman shared how, after a video of mine went viral, the nasty comments she got almost exclusively attacked her looks and her mothering. Those classic feminine areas where society still subtly, or not so subtly, tells women to stay small, sweet, and quiet, and focus on appearance rather than, say, ambition. It's a real double bind.
A real catch-22. And for men, the box.
For men, it's often about the box. This is driven by that immense societal pressure to be strong, in control, and completely invulnerable. Men in our studies frequently talk about getting the emotional struck beat out of them if they dare show fear or vulnerability. I remember a man at a lecture, quite visibly upset, telling a story about his high school football coach screaming at him, "Don't be a pussy." He said in that single moment he learned this devastating lesson. I am not allowed to be afraid. I am not allowed to show fear. I'm not allowed to be vulnerable. Shame is being afraid, showing fear, or being vulnerable. It creates this almost unbearable weight of needing to appear invincible.
That's incredibly sad. And how does that typically manifest?
Well, the research suggests the most common responses from men feeling shame are often pissed off or shut down. It might come out as rage. I heard from a therapist who admitted he'd spent 20 years just steamrolling everyone because he'd unconsciously turned his fear and vulnerability into anger. Or it can manifest as complete emotional withdrawal, just shutting down all feelings. And what's really complex and quite heartbreaking is that while many women say they want men to be vulnerable, when it actually happens when men show genuine vulnerability, we often recoil. We might react with fear or disappointment, or even a subtle kind of disgust. And in doing so, we unintentionally reinforce that message that it's safer for men to just pretend or not be vulnerable at all.
That really highlights the complex interplay of societal expectations for everyone, doesn't it? Keeping us stuck in these patterns. So, given these deep fears and cultural pressures, what are the practical ways we try to shield ourselves? You talk about the vulnerability armory, these shields we use for protection, even if they end up being heavy or suffocating. What's the first one? Foreboding joy.
Exactly. These shields are common coping mechanisms, often unconscious. Foreboding joy is a really interesting one. It's that paradoxical dread that clamps down on momentary joyfulness. It shows up in different ways. You could be rehearsing tragedy, standing over your sleeping child, feeling immense love, and then immediately picturing something awful happening. Or it might be adopting this stance of perpetual disappointment, where you almost prefer to live in a state of low-level letdown because it feels less painful than hoping for something wonderful and then being crushed if it doesn't happen. The idea behind it is to try and beat vulnerability to the punch. If you imagine the worst, maybe it won't hurt as much if it happens. That's the flawed thinking.
So, how do you counter that? How do you allow yourself to feel joy without waiting for the other shoe to drop?
The antidote, perhaps surprisingly, is actively practicing gratitude. Our research consistently showed gratitude isn't just a fleeting feeling, it's a practice. A spiritual practice almost. It's linked to believing in human connection, acknowledging that there's enough and I am enough. People we spoke to often distinguish happiness, seen as depending on circumstances, from joy, seen as this deeper engagement with life through gratitude. And from people who had experienced profound loss, parents losing children, survivors of immense trauma, three key lessons about joy emerged. 1. True joy lives in the ordinary moments. We often miss it chasing the spectacular. 2. Be deeply grateful for what you have. Don't apologize for your joy because others are suffering. Celebrate it fully. Honoring your joy honors what others may have lost. And 3, don't waste joy by using to practice despair. Leaning into joy, even when it feels risky, actually builds resilience. It strengthens you for when tough times inevitably come. My daughter, Ellen, when she was about 6, seemed to grasp this intuitively. We're having a lovely time on a paddle boat, and she suddenly closed her eyes. She said she was making a picture memory, so she could look at it later if she felt sad or scared. That's resilience building right there.
That's absolutely beautiful. Children often have such wisdom, don't they? Okay, another shield. One I suspect many of us, especially in demanding fields, grapple with. Perfectionism. How does that armor us up?
Perfectionism. It's unequivocally a self-destructive and addictive belief system. It's rooted in this completely false idea. If I look perfect and do everything perfectly, I can avoid feeling shame, judgment, and blame. But the problem is, perfection doesn't exist. It's an illusion. It's also much more about what other people think than about healthy self-improvement. And you can't control what others think, so it becomes this exhausting, addictive cycle. When we inevitably feel shame, the perfectionist thinks it's because I wasn't perfect enough, driving them even harder. And it absolutely strangles creativity, because real creativity requires messing up, experimenting, being comfortable with imperfection.
So, what's the way out of that trap?
It's about embracing good enough, truly appreciating the beauty of cracks. A friend of mine, a photographer and coach, uses mantras like quick and dirty wins the race and perfection is the enemy of done. She says becoming a parent basically beat the perfectionism out of her. Life is messy, humbling. Nicholas Wilton, an artist, puts it beautifully when he talks about art, like being human, being perfectly imperfect, accepting flaws, finding beauty in them. It reminds me of that Leonard Cohen lyric. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's through those imperfections that connection, light, real beauty enter.
Good enough is really effing good. I like that one. A great antidote to impossible standards. And that idea of cracks letting light in, very powerful. Now, closely linked to perfectionism, perhaps, is the next shield, numbing. You say this goes way beyond obvious addictions.
Oh, absolutely. Numbing is a universal strategy we all use to escape discomfort. And it takes countless forms. One of the most common in our culture today is just being crazy busy. This belief that if we just stay frantic enough, the uncomfortable truths, the vulnerability, the quiet pain, it just won't catch up with us. While addiction is clearly a chronic form of numbing, we all do it in smaller ways. Too much screen time, constant worrying, comfort eating, maybe excessive shopping. But here's the critical point. You cannot selectively numb emotions. If you numb the dark, you numb the light too. You dull the pain, yes, but you also dull your capacity for love, joy, belonging, creativity. Everything gets muted.
Why do we do it then, if it has such a high cost?
It's often driven by anxiety and disconnection, especially when shame gets mixed in. For instance, if you feel constantly anxious and believe you should be able to handle everything but you can't, shame kicks in hard. Numbing feels like the only escape from that unbearable mix. Or if you feel deeply disconnected and believe it's because you're unworthy of connection, that pain is so acute you just want to check out. The antidote involves learning to actually feel your feelings, to sit with discomfort, practicing mindfulness around your go-to numbing behaviors, developing the capacity to lean into the discomfort instead of running. And this often requires setting some serious boundaries in your life, not just managing the surface anxiety, but addressing the roots by aligning your life more with your values. We distinguish between shadow comforts, things that offer temporary relief but ultimately drain your spirit, and true comfort, things that genuinely nourish you. It requires real honesty. Is this choice truly nourishing me, or is it just helping me avoid feeling vulnerable, even subtly?
That's a really searching question. The intention behind our choices. Okay, the next shield, Viking or victim, sounds quite stark, very black and white.
It is. It describes this polarized worldview. You see yourself and others as either dominating and controlling the Vikings or constantly powerless and taking advantage of the victims. This often stems from unresolved trauma and forces everything into this incredibly limiting win-or-lose framework. No gray areas, no nuance, just power over or powerlessness. It feels safe because it simplifies a complex world, but it severely restricts your ability to feel empathy, to collaborate, to connect authentically.
And where do you see this playing out most destructively?
Well, we see its negative impact in many high-stakes environments. In the military, for example, the necessary culture of controlled aggression and emotional suppression can, unfortunately, make it very hard for individuals to process trauma or seek help, contributing to tragically high suicide rates. Similarly, in professions like law, the intense pressure for perfectionism, adversarial approaches, and emotional detachment are often linked to burnout and mental health crises. In corporate settings, this rigid win-or-lose thinking just kills trust, stifles innovation, and limits adaptability. The antidote involves courageously redefining success beyond that simple binary. It means reintegrating vulnerability, seeking support, offering support, and recognizing that real strength often lies in interdependence, not just rugged individualism. Initiatives that foster connection and mutual support, especially for those in demanding roles like veterans or first responders, are so vital. They model a shift from judgment to connection.
A crucial point about redefining strength, especially in those fields where appearing invincible seems paramount. Now, speaking of connection, you said earlier that true vulnerability isn't oversharing. So what are floodlighting and smash and grab? Why are they shields, not connection?
You're right, they are definitely not true vulnerability. They're protective strategies that actually push people away. Floodlighting is when someone shares intensely personal information too quickly, too much, too soon. The underlying motive might be to discharge their own pain, or maybe test the other person's loyalty. Will you stick around if I tell you this really raw thing? Or even try to hotwire intimacy, force a connection that hasn't been earned. But it almost always backfires. People tend to pull back from that sudden, intense exposure. It leads to more disconnection, more shame for the person doing it. You can't really weaponize vulnerability or use it just to offload your own discomfort.
Okay, that makes sense. And smash and grab sounds quite aggressive.
It is more overtly manipulative. Smash and grab is about deliberately crashing through social boundaries with shocking or intimate information purely to grab attention, energy, or reaction. You see it a lot in sensationalist media or celebrity culture, using personal details as a tool for public consumption. Both floodlighting and smash and grab are fundamentally one-way streets. They aren't about building mutual, trusting connection. So the antidote for both lies in clarifying your intentions, setting respectful boundaries, and focusing on cultivating genuine, reciprocal connection. It means asking yourself honestly, is sharing this truly about connecting with this person? Am I asking for what I need respectfully? If the intention isn't mutual connection and respect, it's probably a shield, not vulnerability.
It comes back to that self-awareness and intention again, be mindful of why we're sharing. Now, the next one, serpentining, conjures up such a vivid image. What is that exactly?
Serpentining is, yes, a slightly comical but ultimately exhausting metaphor for spending huge amounts of energy trying to dodge vulnerability instead of facing it head-on. It comes from that scene in the film The In-Laws, where Peter Falk is yelling, "Serpentine, shell!" to dodge imaginary bullets. In life, it's about doing that frantic zigzag to avoid conflict, avoid discomfort, avoid criticism, avoid potential shame. It looks like hiding, pretending things aren't happening, chronic procrastination, constantly rationalizing, blaming others, maybe even lying. Any complex maneuver designed to control a situation by avoiding the direct, honest path.
We've all done that, I suspect. So how do we stop serpentining?
The antidote is straightforward, though not always easy. Presence. Paying attention to what's really going on, and moving forward directly. Just like the myth about needing to run zigzag from an alligator, it turns out they're quite slow, you don't need to serpentine. Often the threats we're frantically dodging aren't nearly as dangerous as we imagine. It's about choosing to lean into the reality of the situation, however uncomfortable, rather than wasting all that energy on avoidance.
That feeling of emotional zigzagging is certainly familiar when a difficult task looms. And finally, the shields of criticism, cynicism, cool, and cruelty. How do they protect us, and what's the cost?
These are quite insidious shields. They're used to project this image of detached coolness or maybe intellectual superiority. It's a way to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of caring too much, seeming too eager, too earnest, basically uncool. We might use our job titles, our education, even a kind of cultivated nonconformity as weapons, dismissing or belittling others to feel safer or smarter ourselves. The real danger, though, is that when we rely on these, we start becoming defined by what other people think. We gradually lose our willingness to be vulnerable, to put ourselves out there genuinely, and our own spirit can get absolutely crushed by the negativity and hatefulness that often fuels these behaviors, especially online.
So how do we defend against that? How do we stay open without getting crushed by negativity?
The antidote here is shame resilience, which acts like a balance bar on a tightrope. You need to be able to reality check criticism, especially the cruel, cynical stuff, with a very small, very trusted circle. I call them stretch mark friends. The people who know you, truly know you, strengths and struggles, warts and all, even the uncool bits, their opinions matter. As the author Scott Stratton brilliantly put it, don't try to win over the haters. You're not the jackass whisperer. Pouring your energy into trying to convince critics who operate from cruelty or cynicism is it's a losing game. It guarantees disengagement and wears you down.
You're not the jackass whisperer. A brilliant mantra for dealing with online negativity. It's incredibly clear how these shields, meant to protect, actually block us from connection and living fully. Which brings us to a really critical concept you talk about, minding the gap. That phrase immediately makes me think of the London Underground warning. What does it mean here?
Minding the gap is precisely about paying close attention to that space, that discrepancy between where we are and where we want to be. It's the gap between our aspirational values, what we say we believe, what's written in our mission statements or family rules, and our practice values, how we actually live, behave, think day in, day out. Are we walking the talk, or is there a disconnect?
And what happens when there is a gap?
That gap creates what I call the disengagement divide. When leaders, parents, teachers, whole systems fail to live up to the values they preach, people check out. They disengage emotionally, mentally, sometimes physically. It happens in families, schools, organizations, communities. It's a fundamental breach of trust. Let's think about some family examples. Aspirational value, honesty. Practiced value, maybe rationalizing small dishonesties. A parent tells their kids stealing is wrong, but then shrugs when a shop assistant forgets to charge for something, say, oh, well, their mistake. Yeah, that sends a really confusing message, doesn't it?
Completely undermines the stated value.
Exactly. Or aspirational. Respect. Practiced. Maybe prioritizing convenience over respect. A parent is too busy on their phone to step in when one child damages another's belongings, just saying, oh, sort it out yourselves, instead of teaching accountability and amends. Or parents preach about setting limits around, say, drinking, but then constantly tell glorified stories about their own wild teenage years, creating a real conflict for their kids.
Right, those inconsistencies are powerful. What does alignment look like?
Alignment looks like modeling. Imagine parents whose values are emotional connection and honoring feelings. That a son comes home gutted after a terrible sports practice. Instead of saying toughen up, they say something like, wow, that sounds really hard. We don't know exactly how you feel, but we want to understand. High school sport was tough for us too, in different ways. We're just here with you. That open, vulnerable response builds connection. The key isn't perfect modeling. It's being engaged, willing to mind the gap, admit when we mess up, and try to make it right. It shows it's okay to be imperfect as long as we're committed to aligning our actions with our values.
That's such a helpful framework for spotting those gaps in our own lives and in the systems we're part of. It clearly has huge implications beyond the family. How does this apply in professional settings, in education? How do we bring more humanity back into work and learning?
Well, to really spark creativity, innovation, genuine learning, leaders have to fundamentally rehumanize these places.
Yeah.
And that means having the courage to confront scarcity thinking, to engage with vulnerability, and crucially, to recognize and combat shame. Having honest conversations about vulnerability and shame at work, it is disruptive because it shines a light into dark corners. And once that light is on, it's very hard to go back.
So, how does shame manifest in organizations? What are the warning signs?
Shame acts like termites in an organization. It silently eats away at the foundation's trust, engagement, innovation, productivity. It breeds fear. You see it in cultures rife with blaming, gossiping, favoritism, public criticism, humiliating reprimands, reward systems designed to belittle. I heard a dreadful story about a financial firm where offices were allocated based on quarterly results, with public winners boards and losers lists. Imagine the impact of being publicly labeled a loser after one bad quarter. It drove talented people away.
That sounds horrific, a culture of fear, essentially.
Precisely. And organizations also face external shame threats. Think of media outlets publishing teacher shame lists based purely on test scores, or the routine vilification of entire professions, lawyers, bankers, even healthcare professionals sometimes. Leaders have a responsibility to push back against that, to insist on fairness and accuracy, to protect their people from that corrosive external shaming. And remember, blame itself is often just a symptom of shame. It's discharging pain and discomfort, not solving anything. It just creates more hurt and defensiveness. And a cover-up culture where protecting the system's reputation overrides basic human dignity. That's a massive red flag for systemic shame, unethical practices, and zero real accountability.
A truly toxic mix. If shame is so damaging, how can organizations possibly foster honest feedback? Feedback is essential for growth, but it's often so fraught with discomfort.
Feedback, when done well, is actually an act of respect. When honest conversations don't happen, people start to disengage because they question if their contribution matters or if you're really invested in their development. The discomfort often leads to armoring up, either delivering feedback like a rigid reprimand or receiving it defensively. Neither allows for learning. The key is what I call sitting on the same side of the table. It's a metaphor from social work training. You literally sit next to the person putting the problem or issue in front of you both, not between you across a desk. It means listening deeply, asking questions, acknowledging strengths first, and then using those strengths as a bridge to talk about areas for growth. For example, a manager might say to a team member, "Your dedication to getting the details right on this project has been outstanding. Because you have such a great eye for detail, I wonder if we could brainstorm ways to also ensure the final report meets the deadline. See how it leverages the strength."
That shifts the whole dynamic, doesn't it? From judgment to collaboration.
Exactly. And vulnerability is central for both people in feedback. It takes courage to ask for it, to receive it openly, and to give it constructively and kindly, especially when it's difficult. Think about sales or any client-facing role. Being able to say, "Actually, I don't know the answer to that, but I will find out for you," or "I made a mistake there, I apologize." That's not weakness. That's vulnerability building trust. It shows
Yeah.
integrity and commitment, far more than pretending to know everything.
That's a brilliant reframe of feedback, moving it from critique to shared problem solving. Finally, let's bring this right back home to parenting, perhaps the ultimate arena for vulnerability. How does wholehearted parenting work in this never-enough culture?
Wholehearted parenting isn't about finding the perfect how-to guide. It boils down to a much deeper question. Are you, the adult, the person you actually want your child to grow up to be? Who we are, how we engage with the world. That's a far stronger predictor of our children's well-being than any specific parenting technique. The aim is to raise children who feel courageous, engaged, and fundamentally worthy.
And how do we cultivate that sense of worthiness in them?
It starts with us. Our children's sense of worthiness begins in the family. We have to model our own journey of believing I am enough, embracing our own imperfections. We need to be so careful about the messages we send, often unconsciously, about what makes them lovable or acceptable. Are we tying it to their achievements, their appearance, their compliance? The writer Toni Morrison gave some profound advice. Let your face speak what's in your heart when your child walks into a room. Show them genuine gladness, not a critical once-over. That small, consistent act sends a powerful signal of their inherent worth.
That's beautiful. And what about when they mess up? That difference between shame and guilt seems crucial here.
Absolutely critical. We want our children to feel guilt, feeling bad about a behavior. Guilt is linked to positive things like remorse, empathy, wanting to make amends. We desperately don't want them to feel shame, feeling bad about who they are. Childhood shame is linked to so many struggles later in life: addiction, depression, aggression. So the key is always separate the child from the behavior. Instead of "you're a bad boy," it's "you made a bad choice." Just like saying Daisy's a good dog who did a bad thing, not Daisy's bad dog. Shame experienced in childhood, feeling fundamentally unlovable, can get stored as trauma. It can echo down the years. But parents have huge power here. Think of a child's life like a photo album. Those inevitable shaming moments are like small, difficult photos. Parents can influence how much power they have by surrounding them with countless other pictures. Pictures of worthiness, hope, struggle, resilience, courage, failure, success, vulnerability.
So it's about context and consistently reinforcing their worth despite mistakes. And what about all the judgment between parents? Those mummy wars or daddy wars about different parenting choices? How does daring greatly fit in there?
Well, if we genuinely care about all children's well-being, we need to support other parents, even when their choices differ from ours, rather than shaming them. That judgment and attack often comes from our own place of scarcity, our own doubts. Daring greatly as parents means finding our authentic path, the one that aligns with our values, and respecting that others are on their own different journey. We don't have to agree, but we can choose empathy over judgment. And finally, perhaps the hardest part of wholehearted parenting is having the courage to allow our children to experience vulnerability and failure themselves. If we constantly rush in to fix things, hush the critics, guarantee success, they never learn to dare greatly on their own. They never build that resilience muscle. I remember a story about my daughter being terrified to swim a particular race, the breaststroke, because she knew she was slow and feared humiliation. The protective instinct is to pull them out, shield them. But the courageous parenting choice was to let her face it. The advice we gave her was, what if your goal isn't winning, or even finishing with the others? What if your goal is just to show up and get wet? It shifted everything, from winning to courage, from fear of failure to the bravery of just showing up. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for ourselves and our kids is just show up.
That's such a powerful and really beautiful note to end on. That courage is often found in just showing up, in the small, everyday acts. We've really covered some ground today, haven't we? Unpacking how vulnerability is actually the heart of courage and connection. How shame is that deep fear of disconnection. And how pushing back against that never enough culture means choosing authenticity, empathy, and leaning into our imperfections. These insights really do offer profound ways to think differently about our lives, our work, our families, encouraging us all to step into that arena.
And perhaps a final thought to reflect on. Maybe the greatest act of courage isn't some huge dramatic gesture. Maybe it's just the quiet daily commitment to showing up as your true, imperfect self. What might you risk seeing or being seen as, just for the quiet sense of freedom that might offer?
What a question to ponder. Thank you so much for sharing such incredibly valuable insights with us today. It's been truly illuminating. If this deep dive has resonated with you and sparked some new thinking, we'd be genuinely grateful if you'd consider rating and sharing it with others who might also benefit.